On behalf of the International Dyslexia Association, Massachusetts branch, thank you for joining us for our parent webinar, Supporting Your Struggling Reader During the Pandemic.
So I want to introduce our first guest speaker. That it's Michael Gregory, the clinical professor of law at Harvard Law School and a member of the faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And Mike Gregory teaches and serves as the managing attorney of the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative, a joint program of Mass Advocates for Children and Harvard Law School. And he co-teaches Harvard's Education Law Clinic, in which law students provide special education representation to individual families where traumatic experiences are interfacing with the student's disabilities and inhibiting effective progress in school. And TPLI, as it's known, also pursues a larger public policy agenda through systemic advocacy to create trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive schools. Mike and his husband Matt live in Hyde Park and are the proud parents of 4-year-old Isabella and Roscoe, the goofy golden retriever. So Mike is going to talk to us today about how to understand and navigate school services during this unusual time. So thanks so much for joining us, Mike, and I'll hand it over to you.
Good. So I have the fun task of sharing all the dry legal information, which probably will be a little mind-numbing, but hopefully helpful. And then I think the subsequent panelists will really share some important and helpful information about reading itself. But what I'd like to do is just summarize for you the most recent guidance from our State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. First, about what remote learning should look like for all students, and then some specific things that will be applicable to students who have individualized education programs and are receiving special education services. Then share a little bit about what we're seeing as advocates as we work with our own clients and also hear from others across the state in terms of what, the guidance is what's supposed to be happening, but we're seeing that it's not exactly what's happening everywhere. So some of what we're seeing, and then some of what you can do as a parent or a caregiver or someone supporting a student if things aren't going maybe the way that they should. So first, the department has sort of organized our timeline here into thinking about 4 phases of remote learning. And the first phase, from their point of view, were those first couple of weeks when schools were first closed. And the information that was going out to most parents and districts was that, first of all, do what you need to do to provide for the safety and nutrition and foundational needs of students. And that on top of that, really enrichment activities was what districts were obligated to provide, but not core instruction and not free appropriate public education for students with disabilities. And this came from an unfortunate guidance from our federal Department of Education. Thankfully, the advocates got into gear and did a lot of advocating, and this sort of launched us into what is now being called phase 2, which is when that federal guidance was rescinded and it was made clear that really for the whole country, including here in Massachusetts, students who are on IEPs remain entitled to receive their free appropriate public education during a period of school closure, regardless of what is provided to other students. So the department made this clear in a FAPE FAQ that was issued on March 26, and also on that same date issued renewed learning guidance for all students, which informed us that enrichment really isn't enough. All students are entitled to engage in actual learning and instruction during this time. And the department in these guidances laid out some basic guiding principles and broad outlines that I'll summarize. On April 24th, new guidance was released related to regular education remote learning, which is meant to enhance and refine what was in the prior guidance. And this sort of launches us on phase 3. So phase 2 is kind of like, okay, we're going to really do this in a serious way and try to educate all students, but we're not really exactly sure what that's going to look like. But now after lots of listening and trying it out, we're in a position a month in where we can refine and maybe aspire to something a little bit more. So I'll summarize this phase. And then phase 4 will be when we go back to school, whatever that looks like. And likely, even when school is back in session physically, there will still be some amount of learning that's happening remotely if social distancing measures continue to be in place. So what are the guiding principles that we're operating under? So thankfully, the department has articulated that we must look at students' needs in holistic ways. First and foremost, we must protect their safety and well-being, but we also have to really be very serious about equity considerations and understanding that some students, particularly those who might have IEPs or have disabilities, may not receive remote instruction or benefit from it in the same way that others do. And many families are laboring under some very serious hardships at this time, which make it very difficult to engage in remote learning, and we have to understand this and adapt accordingly. And finally, as important as learning itself is, the skills and the content that we want students to continue acquiring during this time, probably even more important than that is maintaining a sense of connection to school, maintaining a sense of connection to a school community, and really holding on to the close relationships with adults and peers that make kids want to go to school and prioritize their own learning. So some general guiding principles about what remote learning models should look like. We should keep realistic expectations. Kids probably aren't going to get to the place that they would have gotten at the end of this school year because things have just changed so drastically and we're all operating under so much stress. So we just have to keep that in mind. There is an obligation for districts to provide meaningful and productive learning opportunities, not just enrichment. And remote doesn't necessarily always mean online. It can mean talking over the phone. It can mean completing packets that are sent by email or that are sent to the home by mail. So just because it's happening remotely doesn't mean that everything has to be happening in a Zoom interface the way that we are engaging right now. The overarching goal for this third phase that the department has articulated is that we should be moving all students toward consistent engagement in remote learning with a focus on connectedness and on the content standards most critical for success in the next grade. So teachers aren't supposed to be teaching everything that you would have been learning in the final 4 months of fourth grade. They're supposed to be honing in on what are the things that you're most going to need when you get to fifth grade. And that should be the focus of this last part of the school year. So those are the general operating principles, but what are some of the specific recommendations that the department has made? And I put recommendations in quotes here because they are just recommendations. These are guidance from an executive agency, which isn't the same as a law, but it will be interpreted with authority. And so their recommendations, it doesn't mean that districts and schools have to do these things, but if the department's recommending it, you probably better give it a try. So first of all, some basic features of remote learning. Learning should be taking place at home during half the length of the typical school day. So if it's a 6-hour school day normally, then students should be engaged in about 3 hours of learning and work per day. Individual experiences will vary. It's not going to look the same for every student. Those of us who are in the special ed system already know that each learner is unique and individualized and needs individualized support, but now we recognize that that's true for everyone. Again, multiple tools should be utilized, not just online, not just using a screen, but many different tools. The department recommends that grades be shifted to a credit, no credit system versus letter grades. Again, this isn't required, but it's a recommendation. Also, the department recommends promoting students at the end of this year, rather than penalizing students or retaining them if, for example, they weren't able to engage effectively in remote. In addition to those basic features, there are 4 big priorities. One is that we prioritize meaningful connections with adults and peers. So every student should have the opportunity to connect in live, real time, multiple times per week with an educator at school. The department recommends that this take place in the form of supportive two-way interaction. So it's got to be live, it's got to be real time. The student has to be able to ask questions, get feedback, and engage in dialogue. Also, group or individual check-ins, not only for learning, but also just to process how this feels for everyone is a really important thing, not just for students on an IEP, but a best practice for all students. Second, to provide engaging core instruction. Again, not just enrichment. The focus should be on those most critical content standards for the next grade. There should be multiple hours per day of educator-directed as opposed to student-directed or parent-directed learning, although student and parent-directed will also have to be part of the picture. Lessons and assignments should be of a manageable number. I know I've been hearing in my caseload of so many students who are just simply overwhelmed by the amount of work they're expected to complete at home. So we want the amount of work to be manageable. Supports and scaffolds must be provided for students with disabilities and for English language learners. And to the extent practicable, teachers should be providing feedback on student work. It shouldn't just be busy work that students do and then it doesn't go anywhere. They should be getting feedback to the extent practical. In addition to academics, there should be opportunities for enrichment, exercise, and play. And this should take the form of a menu of opportunities with both independent enrichment that students can do, but also an opt-in to group activities that might be supervised or run by somebody else. Fourth, schools should ensure that programming is accessible and secure and communication is streamlined. So weekly communication, as opposed to the barrage of multiple daily emails that so many parents were receiving at the beginning of this, is really best practice. And those emails should be very clear about what is required of students in terms of their learning versus optional activities. The department emphasizes asynchronous lessons. So those might be video lessons that an educator would record, but that the family could watch at any time. Now, this hasn't been working well for all of my clients, but the idea is that with busy schedules, it's hard to log into a live lesson. If you miss it, then you're kind of out of luck. So the department recommends this, but I'm not sure that it works well for everyone. Identify and support students who are not effectively engaging. We know that in almost every school district, there are some families that have either still not been reached or whose students are trying to engage in learning, but this whole remote thing just isn't working for them, and they've really got to be a priority. The department emphasizes that students who are not engaging should not be shamed or disciplined. This is not a time for that, but rather staff should be assigned to each of these students and families to help support them and figure out how to remove barriers to learning, and there should be regular follow-up with this assigned staff person. That's some of the basics of regular education remote learning. Let me quickly summarize special ed. First of all, this rescinded and reworded guidance now makes clear that students do have a right to a free, appropriate public education. Many disability-related modifications and services can be effectively provided online. In terms of the day's topic here on this webinar, I have, for example, a student right now who's receiving his Wilson Reading Program every week, twice a week, online. It's going very well. There are some modifications that the reading specialist is using, but there's no reason that the student couldn't be engaged in that rules-based reading program in an online format, and it's working very well for him. Educational opportunities that are offered to the general student population must be made accessible to students who are on IEPs. And of course, FAPE will look different than it does when it's in a physical school building. In terms of procedures and timelines, every student on an IEP should receive a written remote learning plan from their school district that says how FAPE is going to be implemented during this time of school closure. But I know that in many schools and many districts, families have seen hide nor hair of such a remote learning plan, but it is a requirement and they should be receiving it. Both IEP meetings and more formal due process proceedings, if there's a dispute, can happen virtually. Evaluation timelines and exactly what the IEP annual review timeline is going to look like is still being worked out by the department, and guidance will be issuing shortly. And there is a presumption that additional services may be necessary for students on IEPs when they return to school, in the form of either compensatory or additional instruction to make up for what they've missed during this remote time. What about graduation for students with disabilities? For this year only, because MCAS has been canceled, if you're a 12th grade student who had not passed MCAS, there is an emergency process through which students can earn their competency determination, i.e. their diploma, through successful completion of a relevant high school course in lieu of MCAS. So that's an important thing. And also, what about extended school year services, those summer services that many students on IEPs are entitled to? You should plan for those to happen remotely. This is what districts have been told, but be ready if school is back in session, be ready to provide them in person if that's possible. Here's just some of the things that we're seeing, and I'm gonna quickly wrap up here because I wanna make sure we leave time for our other panelists. But tremendous variability between districts and families in terms of both what's being made available, but also families' ability to access what's being made available. A lack of equitable access to remote instruction, the technological aspects of this. Also problems with language access, a lack of accommodations. I mean, so many students are being given opportunities to engage in remote learning online and have the technological and language access, but it's just not a mode of learning that works for them. And districts and schools have been very slow in some cases to adapt what's being provided for these students. And of course, the thing that we're really concerned about here is just that loss of connection to school overall and what that will mean for reentry in September or whenever reentry happens. So some basic tips that you as parents or caregivers can focus on: request IEP meetings. They're supposed to be holding them. And so please do request them. Mass Advocates for Children has sample letters on our website for how to go about requesting a remote or virtual IEP meeting, and you should be doing that. Downloading the guidances that I've just summarized, and noting where the things that the department has recommended are falling short for your student, and then you'd express those things in the IEP meeting. Communicating barriers to your students' engagement in learning early and often. Just keep emailing the school, keep calling, and document all of your attempts to communicate and resolve issues. And if the district or the school is not being responsive, you should document this. You can still file a complaint with the problem resolution system through the State Department. That's just Google Problem Resolution System Massachusetts, and it will take you to a website where you can download a simple 2-page complaint form and inform the department of ways in which the guidances are not being followed. And finally, reach out to advocates to ask questions. And what I've got here is just a list of some quick resources from Massachusetts Advocates for Children, including some surveys that you can complete to inform us about the problems that you're encountering so that we can pass that information along to statewide decision makers, and then both an English and a Spanish helpline where you can call and speak to a live person and ask your questions and get support. And then the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative for issues related specifically to social emotional learning, mental health, and trauma, which of course is so intimately interconnected with learning and reading and other things. And this is a traumatic time for all of us. We have some resources that you might find helpful, as well as a separate helpline where you can call an attorney colleague of mine and we will answer your questions in real time. So that's me. I probably went over the amount of time that I had. Hope the information wasn't too dry, and I look forward to receiving your calls and doing all that we can to help you support your students through this time. I'll stop sharing my screen now, and I think that I made these resources available to Nate, who can hopefully distribute them by email after the webinar.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was wonderful. I really appreciate it, and that's such timely and helpful information for everyone. Our next speaker, Dinan Messiqua, who's going to give us some information about the kinds of things that we can be doing at home outside of the school setting with our readers to help them to make progress during this time, and also some tools and supports that are out there and available for you to help with that. So Dinan is a special education consultant with over 15 years experience working with parents, teachers, and educators in public and private schools. She coaches parents on how to navigate the complexities of special education system, and also consults to teachers and school administrators in the Boston area. She's a former special educator herself from Brookline Public Schools, and she worked with a district-wide language-based program and then coached general education teachers before joining the Carroll School in Lincoln as a middle school language arts teacher and an Orton Gillingham tutor. I know Dinan well. She serves on our board of directors as the chair of the communications committee, and I'm really happy to have her here speaking with us. Thanks, Dinan.
Okay. Well, thank you, Nate, and thank you so much, Mike, for that wonderful overview of the kind of the legal piece of what's going on right now. Welcome, everyone, and I'm so glad that you're here tonight. I'm Dinan Messiqua, and I'm going to share with you some strategies and tools that you can use at home with your child who struggles with reading. Having been a former special education teacher for 15 years, I'm going to pull from some of those resources. And these resources, as well as many more, are on my website, which I'll give to you at the end of this presentation, so feel free to look at that. I consult with parents to help them develop a homeschool plan for their child during these difficult times. And these are for children who have language-based learning disabilities. And I also give ongoing parent consultations and coaching around how to navigate everything that we're going through right now, and especially with the homeschool piece. One of the parts that I enjoy most about the work that I do is really helping parents like yourselves navigate the complexities and nuances of having a child who learns differently. And I just want to say that in these very difficult times, ordinary pressures have significantly increased on parents. And it's wonderful that you're here tonight, taking the time to develop a toolbox for how to work with your child at home. So I just want to commend you in that. So one thing that we know for sure about children who struggle with reading is that reading, spelling, and writing can be tiring for children with dyslexia. So here are some things that you can do. First and foremost, you really want the activities to feel manageable. So whatever literacy activity you give to your child, and I'm going to talk about some of these activities in a few minutes, you want it to feel manageable. And the reason why you want it to feel manageable is you really want your child to feel a sense of accomplishment and success and feel good energy about what they're doing. If an activity is too difficult, your child's going to feel frustrated. And if an activity is too easy, your child's going to feel bored. The other piece that's important is that work really needs to be given in small chunks. And why is that? It's because it connects to the manageability piece. You want to avoid burnout. You want your child to feel a sense of success and ready to do it the next day. And it's the regularity and the practice of these literacy skills that is what is most important. So it's much more important to do just a few minutes or small chunks of time daily, for example, 10 or 15 minutes of reading fluency a day, than try to build in an hour one time a week, because that's when the children, I think, feel much more frustrated. So in terms of these activities, what is, I think, the most important activity that you can do with your child is read. You can read with them. So try to find a time in the day where you can do this and when you are also in a good psychic space. Because I know that if you're stressed and you're going to sit down and read with your child, the energy, they're going to pick up on that energy. So try to do it when you're kind of in a good place. And it doesn't have to be more than 20 to 30 minutes a day of just reading with your child, and just that daily practice really kind of surrounds your child with the world of literacy. So one of the questions I often get from parents is, how do I know if this is the right level book for my child? So when you're thinking of an independent level book for your child, which means a book that they can read on their own, I always tell them, use the 5-finger rule. If there are more than five words on a page that are difficult for your child, that your child missed, then the book is too hard. So here are some wonderful reading strategies that you can do with your child when you are reading with them. And these reading strategies really help with reading fluency. The first one is what I call choral reading. So that is when you read aloud together with your child. And what that does is that it provides an opportunity for your child to hear the phrasing and the intonation of the sentences. And often for children who struggle with reading fluency, that's very helpful. Another is echo reading. So you read a sentence and your child repeats it. Another strategy, and this is one that's wonderful, is because it keeps your child in active reading mode, is that you read and then stop midway in a sentence and have your child fill in the word or finish the sentence. And what this does is that it really engages your child, and they can't sort of be zoning out when you're reading. They have to follow along as you're reading. And then on the next page, they read and then they get to stop. And you have to fill in the word. And children love that because they get to be in teacher mode. Another important piece is this piece of comprehension. So when you're reading with your child, try to pause in moments and ask questions about what you're reading. So 2 kinds of important questions are factual questions. So for example, these are the what and the where questions. For example, where does Little Red Riding Hood live? And inferential questions, which are more the how and the why questions. For example, why do you think the gingerbread man was so afraid? And what these inferential questions do, the second kind of questioning, is that it really engages what we call higher level order thinking skills, so more the abstract reasoning, which is so important. So another important activity, so reading, we said reading is very important, first and foremost. If you only have time for one thing, do the reading. A second activity that is important is what we call phonological awareness activities. So what do we mean by phonological awareness? Phonological awareness is the ability to hear and manipulate sounds at the sentence, word, syllable, and phoneme or sound level. So what are some examples of some phonological awareness activities? So one is, the first that develops in children is rhyming. So for example, if you tell your child mat and cat, do those rhyme? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Or sit and red, do those rhyme? And they can tell you thumbs up or thumbs down. So this is an important activity because it requires them to be listening to the sounds in the words and to be able to determine whether the sounds sound alike at the end of the word or whether they sound different. Another important activity, and I like this house because it really illustrates what phonological awareness is hearing and manipulating syllables. So for example, if you said the word dining, that has two parts to it, two syllables. Another important activity is what we call phonemic awareness. So this is, can your child distinguish, if you say the word den, that there are three sounds in the word, d, e, n. Now notice that the activities that I told you, rhyming, listening to the number of syllables, listening to the sounds, the beginning, middle, and end, can they distinguish those sounds in a word? None of these activities require reading or writing. They can be done with the lights off in the room. And these activities, phonological awareness, is what we call a prerequisite to reading development. These skills often start developing in young children, and what we often see is that children who sometimes arrive in 3rd and 4th grade, they're struggling with reading, but underneath that is that they're struggling with phonological awareness. So it's very important to develop this as a strong foundation, because this then connects with decoding, which is reading, breaking down words, and also connects with spelling. So you only have to do this 10 minutes a day. That's enough. You could just do 10 minutes a day, and there's some wonderful online games that children can do to foster their phonological awareness. And I'm actually going to show you one of these games. So it's on this website, this link, and I'm going to click on it here. And it's going to, it's just loading, and I'm going to scroll down. So this game is called, let's see if this works. It's called the Chicken Coop. And what this game does is that it asks for children to...
Hi, welcome to the Chicken Coop.
Oh, well,
it looks
see.
like
Okay.
Roy is collecting some eggs, but he needs your help.
Okay.
Do you see the picture on Roy's basket? Fox. Listen carefully. Fox begins with the sound F. Now look at the pictures under the chickens. Witch, fish, bug. Do you know which one begins with the sound F? That's right. Fish begins with the sound F. Bug and witch do not begin with the sound F. The beginning sounds are not the same. Now it's your turn.
So what we see here is that this game is really geared towards, sorry, I'm just gonna, I feel like I lost, there we go. That this game is really geared towards identifying the beginning sound in a word. And you can do this game, and there's lots of other games that are on my website, which really foster the phonological awareness. And kids often love these games. Another activity that's very important is writing. And so this is an example of an activity that you could do with older students. So here's a writing prompt that I picked that I thought was kind of relevant to what we're going through now, which is, should children have increased time during COVID-19? Write an elaborate paragraph explaining whether or not you think children should have more screen time during COVID. Give 3 reasons and make sure you elaborate on each of your reasons. So anytime a child with a language-based learning disability has a writing assignment, and more of a bigger writing assignment, let's say writing a paragraph, you really want to break the writing assignment into manageable individual chunks. So it comes back to this idea of manageability. And the acronym that I like to use is the acronym of POWER. The first step is to plan what you're going to write. So this is the brainstorm phase. Then to organize your idea onto a graphic organizer. Then you write your draft. Then you edit it using chops, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. And then you rewrite or revise, and you make edits on the computer or paper. And you'll notice that I gave time slots next to each one. Now, of course, this is a complete approximation, and it really depends on the child. But the reason why this is important is that you could ask your child to do one of these steps every day. They don't have to do all these steps in one day. And I think the breaking down of the assignment and making it manageable is so important, because that's where the child really feels a sense of success. So what would this assignment look like? So the first step is brainstorming. So in the middle is the question. Answer the question, yes, I think we should have more screen time, or no. And then I have my ideas that are coming out of my web. And I like webs. Some students just like having a blank piece of paper and might make a list of their ideas. It really depends if the child's more of a visual learner or a linear kind of sequential learner. And then the second step is to take these ideas and put them onto what I call a graphic organizer. So this graphic organizer has a topic sentence, the 3 reasons. Under each reason, there's an explanation or example for each reason. That's what these boxes represent. And then the concluding sentence. Now, each of these boxes is one sentence. So this, if you count all the boxes, it ends up being an 11-sentence paragraph. What's in the circles are the transition words, first, second, and third, that introduce each of the reasons. So if we fill out these pieces, so I did this brainstorm. I pretended I was a 10-year-old student or 11-year-old student, and I said yes to more screen time. And then I have my ideas. Oh, I get to connect with my friends. I give my parents a break. It's a great learning tool. And then I have ideas that come off of, oh, I get to connect to my friends. Yeah, I feel happy. I feel less alone. My parents get a break because they have work to do, and they get less stressed if they get breaks. And it's a great learning tool because I really like PBS. And I get to teach my friend. I get to teach things to my friends on FaceTime. I teach them how to do origami. So it's a learning tool because I learn how to be like a teacher. And then I took these ideas, these 3 that I circled in red, and I put them on the graphic organizer. Connect with friends, wonderful learning tool, and helps my parents. And then I filled in kind of an example or explanation for each one based on these pieces here. So I'm elaborating on less alone, elaborating on feel happy. And again, these resources, this graphic organizer and this editing sheet that I'm going to show you next, right here, that I'm going to go over, are on my website. So feel free to, you can download them. So then from the graphic organizer, you write the rough draft on paper or computer, and then we're going to edit it. And what I like with the editing piece is to use the acronym CHOPS, which stands for checking for capitals, handwriting. Now, if it's on the computer, obviously, we're not checking for handwriting. Oral reading, so reading out loud what I wrote. Do my sentences sound complete? Punctuation and spelling. So that's an example of a writing activity. Now, one of the questions I get a lot from parents is, how much time should I be spending on literacy skills with my child? What is what's manageable for them? So it's a great question, and it really depends on a lot of variables. All children are different, but here in kind of the big picture is what I recommend to parents. So the first piece, this first chart here, is time limit per day for each literacy skill. So when I talk about literacy skills, I'm talking about phonological awareness, writing, reading fluency, decoding. And for a child who's 5 to 7, I would say 5 to 10 minutes for each skill. For a child who's, for example, 11 to 13, I would say 20 to 30 minutes. And what you notice is that these time chunks are short, and that's on purpose because, again, we want to build in regularity is much more important than a large amount of time one day a week. It's more the regularity that's so important. Another piece of information that I give to parents about time is how much time you should spend total time per day on literacy skills in addition to reading. So I would say for a 5 to 7-year-old, 10 to 30 minutes. For 11 to 13-year-old, 40 to 90 minutes. It's quite a big range because all children are different, and we have to account for that when we're thinking of, what would be best for the child. Now, remember, you as the parent, you know your child best, so you really can gauge it as you're working with your child. If your child's getting frustrated, then take a break. I always suggest kind of take a break and to get out of that zone and then come back when you're in a better place. So checklists are so important for children because often children really like to see what they've accomplished. So for a child who's younger, a visual checklist can really be helpful because they struggle with reading. So it's hard for them to read what the words are on their to-do list. But if you have a visual, so these are some visuals like, oh, my reading and read aloud. Okay, I'm going to do that. And then there's my phonological awareness, which is an ear because it's a sound activity. And then I have my phonics for the day, and then my writing and spelling. And these are approximate times to spend on each of them. Some children like to have a visual timer. So you could have find a visual online timer, or maybe you have a timer that's not online. Some kids like to see how much they still have to do. Some kids, timers completely stress them out. And so don't use a timer if your child gets anxious with looking at the time ticking away. It really depends on the child. For an older child, you can have here's a checklist. I took out the little visual graphic, but if a visual, it helps them to know what does that mean? Oh, that's reading. Okay. Then definitely put in a visual. So the checklist is a little different. Here there's reading fluency and reading comprehension that I put in. But if you have an 8 to 10-year-old who still needs work on phonological awareness, then definitely that should come in also, and to take another skill out. I say to parents that in general, have your 30 minutes of reading and then have 2 to 3 other skills every day. Don't have a list of like 10 skills you're going to do that day. That's too much. Really try to keep it manageable. The other piece that I want to say is that once a child has completed all the steps on their checklist, give them a small reward. Give them something that they like. If it's a younger kid, maybe a sticker. If it's an older kid, you know your child best. But to build in a daily small reward for completing the checklist, I think is a great thing. Now, another important piece when you're working with a child is to give positive feedback and encouragement. So what I call find the good. And you can always find, even if it's the smallest amount, but you can always find something positive about a piece of work that a child has done. And that's very important, especially for children who struggle in terms of their confidence in learning. So when a child makes an error, you can say, wow, you did a good job with, for example, the consonants in the word. Let's look at the vowel sound again. Or for an older child, if it's a writing piece that you're looking at their writing piece, you could say, you came up with strong ideas for why you think you should have more screen time during COVID. Tell me more about this reason here. Why do you think that's so important to you? And then they tell you, and then you can say, good, now write a sentence for what you just said. And then what you notice there is that you're asking your child to verbalize their thinking before they write. And often for children with language-based learning disabilities, that piece is very important because writing is the hardest part for them because it taxes their reading skills, their reading comprehension skills, their writing skills, their executive functioning skills. It's bringing everything together. So this is why having often a child verbalize first what they want to say and then write it is a very helpful tool. Another important thing in terms of this idea of find the positive is to really reflect and look back with your child at the end of the week with regards to what they've accomplished. So for example, on a Friday, you can look back and say, wow, what a good week you've had. You really spent time on those vowel sounds. And next week, it will be easier to read those words. Or for an older child, you could say, your concluding sentence in your persuasive paragraph was so inspiring and well written, I'm still thinking about it. And what you're doing here is that you're bridging what the child accomplished and you're bridging it into the future, looking ahead, which really makes the child feel good about what they've done and makes them more in touch with what they're accomplishing. So what if you have a child at home who just says, I don't want to do any of this. I don't want to do any of these things, not interested. And it happens, sometimes the child is resistant. What you can do is you can build literacy skills into the day-to-day activities. And for example, here's something you can do with a younger child. Let's say you have a younger child who really is missing his or her friends and really wants to see, is missing the social aspect of school. You could say to your child, let's make a list of all the friends and people we want to Zoom with this week. And so you ask your child, so who would you like to Zoom with this week? And let's say your child says, I want to Zoom with Michael. Okay, what sound does Michael start with? What sound does Michael start with? Michael. And your child says, that's right. What letter makes the sound Oh, M. Great. Write the letter M on this piece of paper. And then you go through and you do that for all the names of the people. And what you're doing is you're building in a phonics activity by making this list without your child even knowing. Your child might know what you're doing, but they might still go along with it, or your child might not be aware. Another thing you can do is make an obstacle course, a real obstacle course in your house or your apartment, and hide letters. You could hide letters in the obstacle course. And once your child comes to the letter, they have to give the name and the sound of the letter. So you're really building in movement. So you get to hide the letters. And then the second time, your child has the obstacle course and they get to hide the letters in the obstacle course. And then once you get to the letter, you as the parent need to give the name and the letter, and that they get to be the teacher. And what you can do as a parent is you could even make some mistakes on purpose and see if your child catches them and they have to correct you, because children love being teacher. So let's say you have your child is older and your child is saying, I don't want to do any of these activities. What I say to parents is try to find what your child is passionate about, what is really important to them right now. And have your child, can they write you a letter as to why this is so important? And tell them they have to give you 3 reasons. And for each reason, your child should write 2 elaborating sentences answering why or how. So for example, let's say you have your child who really wants a phone right now. Have them write you a letter trying to persuade you to get him or her a phone. So you really want to try to tap into what is most meaningful to them. Another important piece that I say to parents is between literacy activities, try to build in movement breaks. Movement is so important because it gets learning into the body, especially for children, well, for all children, but especially for children between the ages when they're young and up to about 8. Learning is very multisensory and children learn through all the 5 senses. So movement it really solidifies what they're learning and integrates learning into their whole system and into their brain. So a fun activity for movement breaks is to build an animal box. So you have a box, and in the box, you're going to write down, and you can do this with your child. You could be the scribe. Write down different movements that animals do. So jump like a kangaroo, leap like a frog, move around like a monkey. And each of these pieces of papers has a different movement. And when it's movement time, your child has to pick a piece of paper out of the box and do what it says on the piece of paper. And you can read them what's on the paper. Children love that. Even 9-year-olds, older kids sometimes enjoy it. For an older child, often they like challenges. So have a timer and see how many jumping jacks or push-ups or sit-ups that they can do in a minute, or how long they can hold a plank. And it can kind of become a competitive thing in the family or between siblings. So these are online resources that pertain to reading. And there's lots of resources right now that are free, that are decodable books online. This one in particular, called Flyleaf Publishing, has some really nice emerging readers decodable books to more advanced readers decodable books. There's also audible.com, which is free right now, where children can listen to stories being read aloud. So there's some really great resources out there. And what I want to say to kind of conclude is that these are difficult times, and that you have to give yourself a pat on the back, and to really know that just by showing up tonight, taking the time to figure out what is going to work best for your child, how to help your child, is a lot. And try to be positive with yourself, not just your child. I know that we're often, really putting so much effort into our children, and we lose sight of how much work we're doing. So you're doing a lot by really showing up and trying to help your child with his or her reading skills. I am going to be giving a longer webinar where I'm going to go into more depth with, give more activities that you can do at home, but also go more into depth with these activities that will be coming up in the upcoming weeks. And if you would like to be notified of the webinar, you can email me, or you can also go to my website, and I will let you know when that webinar is coming up. And the other piece is that in the meantime, I work with parents, I consult and help parents develop a targeted homeschool plan for their children at home, to really help their children not just maintain their reading skills, but make progress. So if you are interested in some coaching around that, I work with parents, and feel free to reach out to me. And I just want to say thank you again for coming tonight to this webinar, and it was wonderful to talk to all of you.
All right, so the next thing I want to do, I'd like to share information about the COVID-19 Relief Fund. And to speak to a lot of this, one of the goals of IDA and of our branch in particular is to make sure that our young people that are in the greatest need are able to receive the services and the support that they need during this time. And so this is a fund that is a national fund, but we have local funds that we're able to provide. And these things can go toward, there's 4 main areas of focus. One is computers, laptops, and tablets for families who can't afford them, to enable them to access remote learning. Second is educational software and other learning tools. There are tutorial stipends for students that need one-on-one learning assistance. And lastly, family advocate stipends for those that are in need of special education advocacy services to help them navigate through this time. So more information will be in the follow-up email. And if you or a family that you know has a need in this area, please don't hesitate to reach out to me individually. You can do that at president.ma@dyslexiaida.org, and I will certainly, that can also just be done by replying to the email that we send out as well, and I'd be happy to facilitate that application process with your family or another that you know that's in need. As our last speaker, I want to introduce Ellen O'Donnell. Ellen O'Donnell is a child psychologist at Mass General Hospital for Children and Shriners Hospitals for Children, Boston, as well as an instructor at Harvard Medical School. She's authored numerous articles and book chapters on topics in child psychology and learning disabilities, coping with a child or parent's medical illness, and positive parenting practices to prevent depression or anxiety in children. She lives in Concord, Massachusetts with her husband and their 2 boys, who find ways to pull her away from reading books and doing yoga to learn to ski, fish, paddleboard, hike, and build stuff in the woods. Thanks so much for being with us, Ellen.
Great. So as Nathan mentioned, I'm a pediatric psychologist at Mass General, where I work mostly with kids who have medical illness, and I have a particular interest in kids who maybe struggle with both medical illness and learning disabilities, because I wear a few different hats, and I have a private practice in Concord where I do neuropsychological assessment and educational assessment, and have a background in that. And one of my main areas of interest in terms of research and practice has always been in parenting. Even more interested now that I'm a parent of 2 boys myself. I have a 16-year-old who's a sophomore in high school, and a 10-year-old who's in 4th grade who does also happen to have dyslexia. And so I am also co-author of a parenting book called Bless This Mess. So I'm going to try and bring a few of those different things together tonight to talk with you a little bit about, advance my slides here, having a toolbox for coping with some of the stress and anxiety that both kids and parents are experiencing and feeling right now with remote learning and the worries about COVID itself, about the uncertainty of everything and when things may get back to any kind of normal. And of course, many families are dealing with other stresses of lack of access to food or internet, even to get in touch with schooling, and financial stress, the stress of having to work from home and parent at the same time, which I know I'm feeling. So we're going to go through maybe having a toolbox for some of those things as well. So anybody on the webinar joining us tonight who is a parent knows that to be a parent is to worry. These are just some of the worries that I have heard from parents that I work with or that I've experienced myself over the past 2 months. I know many parents are particularly worried about regression, about kids falling behind during this time. I'm hearing a lot, and this has certainly also been a bit of my experience, that we're not usually this close to our kids' schooling. We're not usually sitting next to them so much, watching them do their work. And sometimes that new bird's eye view is showing us that they might be further behind and struggling more than we knew, which might lead to worries that they haven't actually been getting what they need, where we might have thought that they were because we knew they were on an IEP and getting services. But, sitting next to them, realizing that maybe they don't have some of the skills that we assumed that they did. Lots of parents are worried that we don't have the skills to teach them those skills or to teach them well, or we may not have the time when we're managing working from home, or multiple kids schooling at very different levels. I've heard some worries, and again, experienced this myself, that trying to be their teacher will hurt our relationship with them. They don't see us as their teachers, nor should they see us as their teachers, unless you already had a homeschooling relationship set up. And so that can create some shifting dynamics at home. I've heard a lot of worries about too much screen time. We'll leave it at that. Certainly worries about kids getting more depressed and anxious. I think teenagers, but little kids too, or younger kids too, that they may be worried also that they're falling behind, or maybe losing motivation to engage in school or get together virtually with friends, or all kinds of things. And of course, we all share the worry that there's no end in sight, and that sense of uncertainty is leading to many mental health concerns for parents as well. So schedules are great. These are a few graphics here. The one on the left was sent to me very early on. It went kind of viral. It was this great schedule that you could kind of adapt a little bit to structure your days at home with your kids. And There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. You'll see from the text that I'm sharing with you here that a friend of mine sent it to me and shared that one of her daughters had sent it to her, and the other two daughters were very angry with their sister for having done that. There was a similar revolt in my house early on when I proposed the idea of having a schedule. No one liked that. The one on the right, I also cannot take credit for also comes from social media. That's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek. We need to laugh a bit at what happens when you actually try to implement a schedule like this. If a schedule works for you, that is great. I do advise keeping it simple and flexible. But certainly something I'm hearing is that this has not worked so well for a lot of families. So in that case, and this goes back a lot to something that Dinan was talking about as well, checklists may be better. So rather than a really clearly structured schedule for the day that's maybe creating pressure or pushback, checklists might be better. So not just checklists of the academic tasks for the day, but you might include on your checklist outside time, creative time, active time, doing some chores around the house. So these are example checklists that we have up on our refrigerator in my house. And, you know, there's varying levels of success. We try to check all 5 tasks off each day and accomplish some goals, but it doesn't happen every day. And we need to be a bit flexible about that during this time as well. Another piece or another tool for the toolbox that I think a lot of the kids that I work with have found helpful is to make a menu of activities. And they might make that themselves, or you might help them or make it for them if you have a younger child. And then you can use that menu for times when they're complaining of feeling bored, for times when you feel they've been on screens long enough and need a break, or as a reward for completing a less preferred task or an assignment. You can say, you know, we're going to sit down and do our 10 minutes of phonics game online, and then you can choose something from your menu as a reward when you're done. So the menu might be, you know, a bike ride, a walk around the block with a parent or a sibling. It might be screen time. It might be playing a particular game or Zooming a friend or a grandparent, or, you know, coloring for a while, or building, whatever they like to do, but to have a menu of things that they enjoy doing. This is really helpful for when they're bored or kind of down too, because when we're bored and down, we can have a hard time coming up with ideas of things to do. And so it's good to have it ready-made and have it listed out, done at a time when you're not feeling that way, when you're feeling better and you're better able to brainstorm some fun ideas and activities. I want to take a quick sort of interlude or moment to make a quick comment on reading, because I think oftentimes that menu of activities will be used as a reward for reading time, and that is perfectly fine. I think a lot of people are familiar with the really compelling research that shows that rewarding kids for reading makes them less likely to pick up a book to read for pleasure in the future. I love that research. Much of it comes out of the work on fostering intrinsic motivation for learning. Much of that work was actually done by my own grad school advisor, Dr. Wendy Grolnick. But we also know that some kids are not intrinsically motivated for reading at baseline, and that's going to be a lot of our kids who struggle with reading because it's just a bit too hard, and it really can undermine any intrinsic motivation that might have been there to begin with. So rewards can work in the short term to help reluctant readers to read, and it is perfectly fine to use them to get them to put in the time that they need to practice. But we don't necessarily expect rewards to work for longer term intrinsic motivation to read any better for a child with a learning disability than they do for an avid reader. So I know I am an avid reader myself, and I don't have avid readers, and I find myself getting really frustrated about that and worrying about it and what does it mean for them. And I sometimes have to set aside my own anxieties and worries about that and realize that, you know, they will read when they're ready. And until then, I can certainly use rewards to get them to do so. And that's fine. It's also important to remember that we all need to cut ourselves some slack. And so while the reading that's done for learning or for school should be that just right reading that challenges them a bit, for downtime reading or other reading, it's perfectly fine if they want to choose a book they've read 20 times before, or a comic book, or, read something online, or listen to something, or whatever it might be, a book on tape or a podcast, or have you read to them, to get back to that point of Dinan's, that the most important thing is really getting that exposure somehow every day to reading. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be reading a just right, challenging book all the time. So I actually included chunking in my presentation as a super tool. And again, Dinan mentioned this when talking about helping kids to complete their work for the day, that chunking makes work more manageable. Chunking also just makes life more manageable. It makes parenting more manageable, as well as learning. And it's really important. It's a really important tool right now where there is so much uncertainty and we don't know a whole lot about how long restrictions on contact are going to last, and whether kids will go back to school in the fall, or if they'll go back to something different in the fall. And there's just so much uncertainty. It's not very helpful to look too far ahead and to focus too much on what we don't know. It's much more helpful to focus on what we do know, and to take things a week, a day, or some days even an hour at a time. So we can have our kids approach their work one task at a time, or even one item at a time, covering up the other items, or printing things out so they can take them one at a time, whatever you need to do to help them chunk. It's also helpful to chunk when we're answering kids' questions and worries about what's going on, to focus on what we know. That we know they're not going back, for example, in Massachusetts this academic year, and that we know some of what things are going to look like for the next week, 2 weeks, whatever it might be, that we know when they go back to school, there will be some differences. They may not have the same teacher. They probably will not have the same teacher. There might not be the same kids in their class, but if we know they're going back to the same school building, we can focus on that. If we know they'll have the same principal or art teacher, but really focusing on what we know and what might be the same and what might be different when we get back to some kind of a new normal. That's really important. It's also really important not to assume that older kids know any better. So I've had high school age patients who were plenty worried about having to repeat a grade. They really thought that that was a possibility, that they would have to repeat their junior year of high school. And that was creating a ton of stress and anxiety until they understood that from the guidelines from Massachusetts, that was not, and from their school and from their own performance, that was not going to happen. This is really helpful for parents too, to think in phases. And it goes back to what Mike shared at the beginning about the Massachusetts guidelines, that we're in currently phase 3 of 4 phases. And I think personally, I have found that really helpful to sort of think about what one thing to focus on at a time. And we can put that information into age appropriate and understandable language for our kids too, and say, as a personal example, there's been some pushback in my house that phase 3 that we're in now includes more face-to-face time, meaning more scheduled Zoom calls with teachers for my high schooler. And so we're just focusing on the fact that that is a statewide thing, that lots of kids are adjusting to that change right now, and that it's, for this many weeks to complete this semester, and that we have no idea whether that's going to continue over the summer or into the fall. So we're just going to take it one phase at a time until the schools figure out what phase 4 really might look like. So a lot of what we're talking about is really focusing on what we can control, and trying not to worry too much about the things that we can't, trying to let go of some of the things that we can't control. We can control things like we can read together, we can play games together, we can rest, we can take breaks. It's important to remember that focusing on what we can control is very different from trying to control our kids. And it's very different from trying to control the outcomes. this goes back to those worries about regression and worries about kids falling behind or never being able to catch up or what they're missing out on. If we focus only on that, those things are out of our control. It's going to create a lot of stress and anxiety. And when parents feel anxious and when we feel out of control, we have a tendency to become controlling. And when we become controlling and try to dictate the schedules and the outcomes and get our kids to do exactly what we think they need to be doing and how they need to be doing it, what we get is a whole lot of pushback. And then we get a lot of conflict and fighting at home, and it just creates more and more stress that really isn't very helpful. So we really just want to focus on what we can control and try to acknowledge and deal with the anxiety of the things that we can't. It's really important for kids to have a sense of control too. And one way you can do this is by giving them choices to, decide which assignment to tackle first, or whether they want to do the independent work in the morning or the evening, those kinds of things, really making sure they feel a sense of control over their own learning too. This can also be a great time to shift our focus a bit. And I've got a little video here for you all to meet Larry. Larry is the robot that my 4th grader built one morning while my husband and I were both trapped in our offices for hours on end. He did this entirely on his own and built Larry the robot. One of his dyslexic strengths, for sure, is building. He's constantly outside building bike ramps and tables and furniture, and I don't even know what. You've got to be careful not to step on nails around here, and any scrap wood's going to get scooped up. This is a really great time to get to know the kids that you have. They have more downtime. They're bored more often. That's not a bad thing. A lot of our kids are overscheduled to begin with. The more bored they are, the more free time they have, the more they get to show us what they're interested in, what intrinsically motivates them, what they gravitate to. It's a great time for us to kind of step back and watch them and watch how and learn how they learn best. I know one thing that I think has been surprising to a lot of parents, we think our kids love being on screens, and then we're finding that those same kids do not love learning on screens. That's where they want to be more hands-on. And so we're learning about them, and we can take those tools and lessons learned with us when we do start to get back to some new normal. Going back to one of those early worries that maybe you're worried that your child actually has not been getting what they need in school during this time or before this time, and you can use this time to plan how you're going to advocate for them, using some of the suggestions that Mike shared, to make a plan, and if you have the time now, some do and some don't, but to consult with an advocate or reach out to the school or request an IEP meeting or communicate with the teacher and tell them your concerns and share with them what you're noticing that you might not have had the chance to notice otherwise. And for all of us to really recognize that maybe the pace and the pressure that our kids were under to begin with was a bit too much. I know there was a Bloomberg article today about the possibility that this could shift our thinking about the high school day and the length of the school day. So, I hope we can bring some of the lessons that we're learning back with us as we hopefully sooner than later start to get into some kind of new normal. So just to wrap up, I can't take credit for either of these quotes. They're both kind of out there in the social media world, but one is that we're all in the same ocean, but we're not necessarily all in the same boat. I kind of want to push back against that saying that we're all in the same boat, because some of you are in really much rockier oceans than your friends may be, or the families of your kids' friends may be, because you started out facing bigger challenges to begin with. So we may all be in the same ocean, but some of us may have better equipped boats. That's the actual metaphor. And it's not helpful to compare ourselves or our kids to others. And of course, it's always important to find some funny and to laugh a little. So that's the message on the left. I definitely resonated with that I really hope come fall I am not the 4th grade teacher again, because it turns out that I'm still not good at fractions. So thank you for spending some time with us tonight and our great speakers. I hope this is helpful to kind of pull it all together and put some perspective on things as well.
And we hope that this has been helpful. One of my favorite things about just each of our speakers tonight was the focus on positivity. And I know that can be really tough right now to be proactive and positive. I've been struggling with it myself at times. One of the biggest predictors, though, of how kids and families cope during times of stress is something called benefit finding. And it's not always easy to find the positive or the silver lining or the benefit in something like a pandemic. But if you can take some of what we talked about tonight to whether it's realizing that you have a strength as a parent that you never noticed, realizing the strength of other family members being stronger than you thought they were, whether it's learning to build a robot or maybe noticing something in your child that you hadn't seen before. We hope that you can take some time to notice those positive things as well, and that the information that we've provided is helpful to you in moving forward in this uncharted territory that we're in. I really want to thank all three of our speakers tonight. Thank you so much for taking time to do this. It's meant a lot, I know, to me and hopefully to the folks that tuned in tonight. So thank you, guys.
If you found tonight's webinar helpful, please consider making a $10 donation to IDA's COVID-19 Relief Fund by texting READMA to 20222 using your cellular phone, or by visiting our website at www.ma.dyslexiaida.org to make a donation in any amount. On behalf of IDA, thank you for joining us and supporting struggling readers during the COVID-19 crisis and always.